Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our next session, one that I've been looking forward to because I got a sneak peek into Alice's slides. So I'm really looking forward to it. I think it's going to be very insightful, entertaining, and very thoughtful. So it's my pleasure to introduce Alice Grover, who'll be explaining executive reporting, what they don't teach you, but you need to know. And the best part is he can talk from a place of experience, being 30 years as an IT leader across multiple industries and scales. He was also the former CIO of Toyota Australia for 8 years, which is where we met initially. He has expertise in building world-class IT organizations and driving transformation. He's also currently an independent IT advisor on IT and cyber security strategies. You can also check out Alice's episode on the Agile Ideas podcast. It's episode 96, and listen to that full conversation as well. But I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to Alice. Thank you, Alice, and welcome.
Yeah, thanks very much, Fatima, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on what time zone you're in. I think Fatima's already given me a lovely introduction, so I'm not going to dwell on that. I think the short summary of that clearly is I've been around for way too long, given 35 years, so you can work out that I'm too old. But I have had lots of opportunities, I guess, to see organizations from the client side across a range of roles, including lots and lots of time in management and in executive roles. So hopefully I can pass on a few tips to you based on experience. What I'm going to be talking about today is really in two categories. The first one is some advice on how to write and present a report or a request to an executive audience, and covering 5 of the sort of most common pitfalls or traps that I've seen people fall into, or that I've fallen into. And the second category is advice on the other side on how to deal with different styles and personalities of executives that you're presenting to. So 5 of the most common challenges. Where I get all this from, and I've got some anecdotes along the way. They're all based on, I guess, real life lived experience, whether it's me being on the receiving end of probably thousands of presentations, or me presenting to executives and to boards, or more recently in my advisory work on advising boards, advising IT leaders on presenting to boards, and so on. I also wanted to briefly talk about what I won't be talking about, just to make it clear. So my late father had liked the saying that 50% of success is actually doing the work and the other 50% is selling it. But that word selling, I think for us as IT people, can carry a bit of a negative connotation. So to be clear, this is not about dressing up bad facts or bad ideas. I'm going to assume that you have the right facts and ideas, and that you need to get the key people to understand and support them so that you get the right outcome for your organization. Now, I do have some little humorous cartoons and anecdotes along the way, but I'm certainly not encouraging you to make light of tough situations or encouraging you to disrespect your stakeholders. That never really works very well. It's just about livening up a presentation. All right, so let's start with the 5 most common pitfalls I find for presenters. So moving to the first one, this is by far the most common one, and I'm sure you've all seen this before. This is the too long syndrome. This is the person who wants to present the whole long story that is not necessarily appropriate for the audience. And here's the thing with that. Not only do you potentially, I guess, lose the point, lose your audience in the process, often you actually annoy your audience enough to make them have a negative reaction to even a good idea that you're presenting, simply because there's just too much there for them to read or to listen to. So this is fairly obvious advice, I guess, but the first point is don't feel you need to give a history lesson. A lot of people want to explain all the steps that they've taken to get to that point because they've done a lot of work, and that's great, but that's not actually what your audience needs to hear. So don't focus on what you want to say necessarily. Focus on what your audience needs to hear from you. And that's quite a difficult, I guess, space to put yourself in the first few times. With a bit of practice, you get used to that. Stating the obvious, most executives are pretty time poor. They've got a lot of meetings, they've got a lot of issues being brought to them. They appreciate when you practice the art of conciseness. And there's a lovely quote there that's often misattributed to Mark Twain. But the point of that is it does actually take more effort to present things more concisely. It's easy, relatively speaking, to present the 48-page report. It's much harder to summarize that in one meaningful page that still conveys the whole essence. But when you make that effort, you usually get a better outcome. So let me show you, I guess, some examples of maybe that taken to an extreme. This is an example of a one-page report. I spent a lot of time at Toyota, and some of you may know Toyota has a pretty strong organizational culture. And one of the things that it insists on is that all decisions have to be presented on one page, one A3 page. Whether it's a really simple thing or a huge multi-billion-dollar decision, you've got to be able to summarize it on one page. Now, what I've got up there, frankly, is just one of the examples that's available publicly on the internet. Obviously, I couldn't put up a real-life example. And unfortunately, this is probably not really the best example, so I wouldn't encourage you to follow it verbatim, but hopefully it gives you a bit of an idea of the style and the types of sections that you might get in a typical one-pager. So to talk you through it, what we'd usually expect to have in something like that, firstly is the background, right? So explain the nature of the problem and why you're trying to solve it. Then a gap analysis. So let's use a real life example. Say you're in a software organization and you're having too many deployment failures that are affecting your clients and your reputation. Right. So the first thing you start with is, where do we want to be? Where are we at now? Right. So we have a deployment failure rate of X%. We need to get to Y%, etc. Then we break down that maybe big problem into a smaller problem that's actually more able to be solved in a reasonable amount of time. So you might, for example, look at dimensions like what types of deployments are failing. Is it particular modules? Is it ones done by particular teams? Are they deployments that are done on particular days, like Friday deployments don't work as well, and so on. So you find ways of breaking down the problem to get to a smaller problem, but one that actually tackles a significant portion of the whole thing. And you set a target up front. So you say, for example, we need to ensure that all non-urgent regular deployments are going to be error-free by December. Then you move into root cause analysis. And this is really, I think, maybe something where Toyota traditionally excels. It's sometimes said that Toyota kind of invented the idea of the 5 whys. The point of the root cause analysis is to ask enough questions that you really get down to the root of it and not the superficial cause, right? So in this example, the superficial cause might be, it's all John's fault. Whenever John does a deployment, it doesn't work well because John's not very good. That's not your root cause. You've got to dig deeper. So find what the issue is with the underlying process or with the training of staff and so on, because only by finding the root cause can you truly solve the underlying problem. Then we get to countermeasures. So you might present a number of potential options for solving the problem. You do a cost-benefit type analysis on those to figure out which one or which ones you're going to recommend to implement. And then there's an implementation plan. I don't need to talk to a PMO expert audience about how to put together a good plan or a Gantt chart. So this is assuming the paper is approved. Here are the steps that we would follow, the timing and the cost and so on. So hopefully it gives you just a rough outline. Again, don't get hung up on the exact format. You don't have to download a template and follow it slavishly. Just gives you a bit of an idea of what works in a very large, mature organization. Now, often you'll find when people are kind of presented with this one-page idea in the first place, that they have a bunch of objections. And the most common ones are these. So the first one is, oh, well, this is just shallow. You're just avoiding doing all the hard work and you're presenting this kind of superficial thing. Yes, you can do that, but that's not the right way to do that. So the right way to do that is you're still doing all the same detailed work. You still have it available. It's only at the end that you're summarizing in a one-page format for your executive stakeholder. But if your executive stakeholder in the meeting says, that's great, but tell me more about how you gathered the data about those deployments, you've still got to have that data available. You still need to have done the work. You just don't necessarily need to have it available for everyone to read up front. The second objection is, well, IT is not like that. It's not like manufacturing and engineering. It's complex, it's subtle. Actually, with some experience, it does work for most issues. Even really large and complex decisions can be done this way. And the third one, this is, I guess, a classic pitfall for people starting off with one-pagers, is they still try to squeeze their 20-page report in. They just squeeze it all into one page with really small formats. That's not the right way to do it. Your stakeholders will not appreciate you coming up with an A3 with 4-point fonts and no white space. The art of it is in the conciseness. The art is in working out what to leave out, not in trying to cram everything onto one page. So look, I'm not necessarily saying you have to present everything on one page, otherwise it's no good, not at all. Every organization is different, has its own culture, has its own standards. This is just, I guess, showing you an example of how you can take this principle of conciseness maybe even further than you've thought of before. Let me move on to pitfall number 2. And this one is about keeping them waiting for the punchline. You see this very often. A person is presenting really enthusiastically, telling a great story, but suddenly with 1 minute left in the meeting, they realize they haven't actually got to the point yet, to the ask, what it is that they're trying to get this audience to agree to. So some advice. This is kind of maybe a little bit unusual, but I've always found it better to start with the request and then work backwards. In other words, the very first thing at the top of your paper or when you first start talking in that meeting is, I am here to ask for $1 million in order to proceed with project X with vendor Y in order to achieve objective or benefit Z. So start with the punchline, then work back, then go into the background, the story, the justification, and so on. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is people don't like to be put under pressure to instantly decide. With 1 minute's notice, if the first time they've suddenly heard is that you're asking for $1 million or whatever it is, people don't like to feel that they're having a gun held to their head with no time to think about it. Give them the time to think about it while you're telling the rest of the story. But the other reason is because you'll find that when you do that, and particularly when you've sent the papers for pre-reading, which I always recommend for people to do, a lot of executives will have already read it. They've absorbed it. They understand what you're asking for. They don't need you to go through the whole background. They can jump straight to a particular point, right? So the meeting can be very short and efficient sometimes with, okay, I get where you're coming from. That's great, Alice. Now, I just want to ask you about, tell me about the process for the competitive selection tender that you did. Show me how that process was fair and objective. And so instead of going through the whole story, you can just focus on specific questions that executive wants you to answer. Moving on to number 3, and of course there's a Dilbert cartoon for everything, right? And this is a Dilbert cartoon about embellishment. This is the tendency that I think we all kind of fall into sometimes as human nature being what it is, to dress up the bad news. We want to please people. We want to tell people what we think they want to hear. Here's the thing though, most executives are really, really used to handling problems. It's kind of the nature of the job. Most of what gets, the more senior you get, the more of what gets brought to you tends to be the things that are going wrong, because those are the only ones that need to be escalated to you, not the stuff that's going okay. So you'll probably find that they're pretty good at spotting problems anyway, and they're probably a lot more used to dealing with them and maybe a lot less stressed than you might expect them to be. Not always, but usually. So start with the bad news. You're going to get more respect and you're going to get a more efficient use of time if you don't go through all the many things that are going right, but you start with the one thing that is actually going wrong and you deal with that first. Always be factual and honest. Most execs have a pretty good BS detector, so to speak. And what happens when they do detect it is not only will they give you a hard time in this meeting, but they'll probably remember you and they'll probably give you a hard time or not trust you in future meetings as well. So you're always going to be on the back foot. When you do bring up problems, demonstrate accountability. Don't go in blaming others, even if it's sometimes very clear that it might be the fault of another team or another person. Instead, find the gap in the process. Don't find the individual to shoot. Find what's wrong with the process. Demonstrate what lessons have been learned and what you or your team will do differently going forward. We'll move on to number 4. This is the kind of the elephant in the room syndrome. So having just said you should always be honest and have bad news first, the problem here is that you're providing the bad news, but you're providing it in the wrong forum, in a big group forum, and you're shocking people and sometimes embarrassing them in front of their colleagues. That's probably not going to lead to a great outcome. So, sorry, there's just a bit of a delay sometimes with these slides. So my advice would be never surface nasty surprises first in a large formal group meeting like a project steering committee or an ELT or a board. Absolutely do escalate it openly and honestly and promptly, but communicate it to your key stakeholders one-on-one first. And you're going to know who those key people are, the ones that are going to feel most accountable, the ones that are going to be most impacted or most concerned about it. Give them time to react to the news, give them time to calm down sometimes, and to consider their reaction before they're in a group meeting with their peers. But also don't wait for the next regularly scheduled group meeting. Escalate ASAP, show that you're reacting immediately. Now moving on to number 5. This is the wishy-washy indecisive request, and there, I'm afraid to say, is a real-life example that I've seen of a paper that was trying to choose which vendor to buy some IT products from, and looking at 5 vendors, recommended, you can choose either vendor A or vendor B. And this paper was going to go to a CEO. Hopefully you can kind of see the problem with that, right? So advice is, don't ever walk in without a clear recommendation or a request. That's, frankly speaking, the job of the person who is proposing the paper and presenting it. It's not the job of the exec to do that work for you. They can either say yes, hopefully, or no if they don't agree. They shouldn't be making a selection decision for you. They shouldn't be working out what to do. So always come in with a crystal clear recommendation or request to show that you've done your homework. So that's the 5 common pitfalls. Let me move on to the other side of the coin. So let's assume that you're bypassing all of these pitfalls and you're doing a fantastic job as a presenter. Unfortunately, there's another side to it, of course. There's people you're presenting to who are human beings too, and imperfect as well, and have their own sometimes interesting or challenging styles or personalities. So let me take you through, I guess, the 5 most common challenging executive styles that I've seen. The first one, again, I think is most obvious, and particularly for an IT audience, we've all seen this before, right? It's the layperson, the executive who doesn't know your subject matter expertise. Now, this to me is not actually a problem. In most organizations, you don't expect your senior executives to actually be IT experts. So I'm not suggesting that there's anything wrong here. I'm suggesting that you anticipate that and make sure that you present things in an appropriate way. And by the way, yes, there is a real life quote there of an executive asking why we can't just train up software developers from scratch with a 2-day course, right? But we can make fun of this, but the reality is we're all experts in something and not experts in other things. So it's pretty easy to fall into this kind of asking dumb questions trap. So first bit of advice, obviously, avoid jargon. I always say when I mentor CIOs or CISOs, it's our responsibility as technologists to ensure that we're understood by the audience. It's not on the audience to become an expert in IT or cyber or whatever your discipline is. It's actually on us to understand our audience and present appropriately for them. Now, sometimes there are some aspects of what you do that you do need to explain to them. You need to educate respectfully, because without that understanding, they're not going to be able to make an informed decision. But where that doesn't apply, and often it doesn't apply, you don't feel that you need to educate them on every acronym and every detail of what we do. We can simplify. We can use metaphors and examples. Again, everyone has an area that's their comfort zone, that they're really experienced in, maybe based on their career background. Find what that is for your audience and find a way to use relevant and interesting metaphors to explain the challenge that you're having or the recommendation you're proposing in terms that make sense to them. Now, obviously, in doing that, don't lose the essence, don't mislead by coming up with bad metaphors, but there's always a way of boiling down the complexity, I think. The same thing applies when presenting metrics. I see a lot of IT people presenting metrics that make a lot of sense in their own subject matter expertise, but actually make no sense to their audience. So always try to get people to boil them down to metrics that actually make sense to the audience, that give them key insights, that have clear targets. In doing that, obviously one advantage is you might get your idea approved, but the broader advantage is if you do this well, you will in time build your credibility with your board or your stakeholders as being the expert that they can trust. And in future, maybe you'll have to do a lot less of the explaining and the metaphors, because they will have that trust that what you're telling them is right. Now let me move to number 2, which is kind of the flip side of this. So this is the non-subject matter executive, but who unfortunately believes that they really are an expert in your particular subject matter when they're not. And I'm sure we've all encountered a bit of this before. I've encountered one that you can see there where someone thought that moving all infrastructure to the cloud should be a really easy project in about a week, despite perhaps not really even understanding what cloud computing means in the first place. So I kind of call this the Yoda exec. And this can be a challenging one, but a bit of advice. Firstly, don't ever start a debate in a group meeting. You're not going to win. Don't feel that you need to take them on, so to speak, and explain to them why they're wrong. Find a way to accept their advice with good grace, so give their ego a win, and to apply it perhaps in spirit, even if not literally. So what is it that they're trying to tell you? Maybe literally doesn't make a lot of sense, but what's the essence of what they're trying to tell you? Is there a different way that you can show that you're listening to them and accepting their advice while still doing sensible things in the background? And when you get better at this, wherever possible, anticipate that advice. As you get to know your stakeholders better, you're probably going to know coming into a meeting that, you know what, I'm going to be getting a little bit of a lecture in X, Y, or Z. So prepare for that so that you can effectively manage your time and your emotions and still get the right outcome. I'll move on to number 3. Again, very, very common, right? Executives are typically pretty busy. They often get very distracted. You might think that the topic you're bringing to them is the most important thing they could possibly be looking at. They may think differently, either because they genuinely have bigger priorities to worry about, bigger problems, or sometimes just because they're really not very interested in your topic. And sometimes they might want to talk to you about something completely unrelated, as you can see there with some examples. I think we've probably all experienced this kind of phenomenon before of switching to the personal IT issues. So what can we do here? Firstly, be clear on why you are there and what you need. Don't come in with an open-ended agenda and start a chat, because it may go in a whole different direction than you want it to. So start with what it is you're trying to achieve. I am here in order to get approval for X, Y, and Z. Respect the fact that they do probably have many, many urgent issues to deal with, and this may be by far not the most urgent. Wherever possible, get to know your stakeholders' motivations and pain points. It sounds obvious, but when I mentor IT leaders, very often they don't know what it is that actually drives their boss. And sometimes it's as simple as they've never asked. There's nothing wrong with asking, nothing wrong with finding out what are the biggest challenges your stakeholders have, whether they have anything to do with what you specifically do in the organization or not, but understand what drives them. And sometimes, and I've had this experience many times before, it's not that they don't want to approve what it is you're coming in there for. They're quite happy to do it. They just want to spend their time on other things. So allow that to happen. Don't feel like you have to give them the whole half-hour presentation because you've worked so hard on it. If you can get the approval in 2 minutes and give them some time back, that can often be a win-win. Number 4, this is the decision avoider. So this is the phenomenon where sometimes it's not just one person, it's a whole committee, where they don't want to say yes and they don't want to say no. They just want to wait and see. They want to ask for more research, more consideration, come back next time. And one of the things is to always, well, firstly, read the room. So with a little bit of practice, you get a little bit better at the psychological side, and hopefully you can see when this is coming. You can see when the room is getting disengaged, when they're clearly starting to shuffle and find reasons why they're not really going to approve this today and they want something else. So pivot early. Don't make them go through your whole presentation when they've kind of already decided what they want to do. Pivot, either break and ask for questions, or pivot to a different way of presenting it if you feel that you're not really getting their attention. Now, if they really don't want to make the decision that you think is the right one for the organization, obviously you've got to stay respectful and calm, but there's nothing wrong with holding people more accountable, even if they're more senior than you. So you need to show the clear consequences of saying no, or even worse, sometimes of delaying and avoiding a decision. If they still want to do that, that's okay, but make it crystal clear that this is the consequence, and by implication, the accountability is on the decision makers and for that consequence. The other thing is sometimes decision makers are very much driven by other key influences, maybe not so much on the fact and on what you're presenting, but on what other people think of it. Again, with some practice, learn who in your organization are the key influencers for each of your executive stakeholders. And that's not always the most senior people. Sometimes it's people who are lower down in the organization, but who, for whatever reason, have the ear of a senior executive. So sometimes it's a case of building support behind the scenes before you go into that meeting with the senior people. And finally, number 5, this is what I call the no pain, no gain executive. Some people's management style is to always say no the first time around. They believe that they get a better outcome and better commitment and accountability from their people if they start by saying no and make you work hard for it rather than just agreeing, even if they basically agree with what you're asking for. So you've got to learn to figure out whether that's the case, whether it's a genuine no or whether people are testing your commitment and your determination. I've had this experience where people want to see whether you believe enough in the idea to come back and try again, perhaps risk your credibility some more by coming back and having a second bite after getting a no. Obviously, this is not always the case. Sometimes a no really is a genuine no, so you need to figure out which one it is. But if you really believe that it's one of these situations, obviously, if at first you fail, try again. But I'd encourage you to ask yourself a couple of questions first before you do that. First one is make sure you really believe this is the best recommendation. Obviously, if you're going to have a second crack at it, you need to be really sure that this is the right thing and you're going to stand behind it. Secondly, ask yourself on a personal level, is this the right hill to die on, so to speak? Being a little bit dramatic, but obviously you can't spend your political capital on every single issue. You can't come back multiple times for everything. So work out what is the right battle that you actually want to fight. Is this worth it? If you do decide to do that, change up your approach. So don't come in with the same line that you went in the first time. Find a different way to justify your position or to explain what it is that you're asking for. And don't be scared to demonstrate your passion as well as your logic. A lot of the time, people with this kind of personality, they're not just listening to the words you're saying and the facts. They're looking at the whites of your eyes, so to speak, and they want to see whether you're really committed to this, whether if they say yes, you're really going to make the best use of this decision. So that's all the content that I was going to cover, but I wanted to leave you with just a few kind of summary points, a few key takeaways. The first point is obviously know your audience, but also know yourself. So have the emotional intelligence to understand your own strengths and weaknesses when it comes to presenting issues and find ways to close that gap. The better you can get at this, the easier it's going to be. Second point is things won't always succeed. Whilst I've given some advice points there, they're certainly not foolproof. You will get no's, you will get rejections. They will sting sometimes. Try as much as possible, and it's hard to do, to not treat them personally. After all, you're in an organization doing a job. People are different, and the reality is not everyone in an organization is going to be your friend. Make sure that you're acting professionally and trying to do what you genuinely believe in is in the best interest of the organization. But don't keep fighting until the end if you can't get your way. And the third point there is presenting, like everything else that you do with your own subject matter expertise. It's a skill. It's something that you can practice and get better at. And I'd encourage you to think of it as an important skill, because the better you get at it, the easier it will make your job and the more value you're going to be able to deliver to your organization. So with that, and with Spider-Man, great power comes great responsibility. Happy to open up to any questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Alice. That was really insightful. I was saying I was looking forward to your presentation. When I saw the slides, they were a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I think sometimes we need that, especially at the executive level, just a little bit of softness to deliver that message. So that was super helpful. Thank you. I do have some questions that have come through and a couple of my own, but let me share the first one. So just pop it on stage. If you could redesign how organizations approach executive reporting from the ground up, what would you change first?
Really good question. So many things I do. I think the first thing, to be honest, that I do is clarify accountabilities and decision rights. It's not something I've really talked about in this presentation, because this has been more focused on individuals and how to get the best outcome as an individual presenter. But I think on an organizational level, a lot of organizations have very muddled and ambiguous decision-making approaches. Sometimes, I'm sure you've all seen this, you need to present to 5 different people to get approval for something. It's not really clear who ultimately has the decision authority. So if I had the magic wand, so to speak, and start from scratch and fix it, I would try to have really, really clear accountability and decision-making matrices. Who has the D, to use that old saying, who has the ultimate decision right for any given issue? Lots of other people can be consulted and can provide input, but who actually has the decision? There should be one person.
And then in terms of some of your past experiences, would you say that there's any examples of major red flags that maybe were missed either in a report or in insights that were shared up the line? I mean, we all know that by the time a report gets to the C-suite, it's probably been changed and modified and adapted many times to suit whatever narrative is going in front of the board or the executive. But is there any missed red flags or experiences or examples that you've seen or come across?
Yeah, plenty. I guess a classic example I'll give is, and it's sort of related to my first point, is the this kind of exaggerated consensus building thing. So it's the phenomenon where you've written the presentation, you've got to take it through 14 different stakeholders, and each of them has input. Each of them wants you to change something in your paper. It may be material, it may be immaterial. But as you go through them, you then find your paper gradually morphs into something that has little relation to what you started with. And often what you'll find is that the feedback from stakeholder 10 now contradicts the feedback from stakeholder 2. So you've got to go back to stakeholder 2 and say, well, this guy told me something different, etc. You can get tied up in knots for months that way. And I think that's a really classic failing in organizations that are highly consensus driven and that have that kind of approach of you need to get absolutely everybody lined up and fully agreeing, not just with your idea, but with your presentation of the idea. So that's one common thing I've seen, and again, probably the solution to that is what I just said the first time around, which was clear decision rights. So it doesn't mean that you don't talk to those 14 stakeholders if they're impacted by your decision or they've got an input into it. But it should be clear then that what you're doing is consulting. You're taking their input on board where it's appropriate, but ultimately it's up to you as a presenter to work out which of that feedback you're going to take. And it's ultimately up to the final decision maker to decide whether he or she is going to agree to that. So you don't get stuck in this endless feedback loop.
Do you think one of the things I say quite often, and I'm experiencing this a lot at the moment, where it feels like it takes a month to prepare this monthly steering committee just because of those 14 plus conversations that you're having. Do you think that executives appreciate just how much time, energy, and effort goes into preparing a simple steering committee or executive report?
Not always. Some do. I think it depends on their background. Some have been in that role or like roles before, and they absolutely have empathy because they've done it before. Others don't. I think there is often a lot of kind of taking for granted of that. And it's not because people are not empathetic or don't care. I think it's because often what's assumed is that that steering committee pack that you've prepared, you already had that anyway, because you're already using that internally in order to manage your project or your program. So all you're doing is regurgitating it and putting a different front page on it. And we all know that's usually not the case, but that's a very common assumption I find, particularly project related presentations. So yeah, it's a difficult one. Look, steering committees will often, dictate the type of reporting that they want. But again, there's nothing wrong sometimes, respectfully and appropriately, with questioning some things. Do you really value all of this reporting? We're giving you all of this stuff. Is that useful to you? Because frankly, it's taking X person days of our time, and it takes your valuable time as an audience to listen to it as it's presented. Is there something we can remove? So, challenge maybe at the end of a meeting as one of your agenda items. What can we actually simplify here? What can we cut down from the next report?
It's a good point, and it also links into some of the messages in previous sessions where the executive and panelists were talking about storytelling. And so I think to your point, spending what I feel like a month sometimes, not physically preparing a pack, but getting the messages, understanding the story, knowing where we are, identifying the risk, mitigating, going through the throes of understanding that, I think is really, really helpful. So thanks for sharing your thoughts on that. My last question that I have is obviously now, Alice, you're doing a lot of independent IT advisory and virtual CIO work. And so I'm keen to understand, what are the key, I guess, concerns, themes, or areas that executives care about right now? I mean, I'm sure you're probably going to mention perhaps AI, but is there any other sort of top concerns or risk areas that you're hearing from your clients?
Look, I wish I didn't have to mention the dreaded dirty word AI, but yes, of course, that is on the minds of many, many, many executives across multiple organizations. I'd say probably they don't always know exactly what they want out of it or why they want it, but pretty much all of them want a response to it. They want a strategy for it. So that's absolutely there. But putting that aside, because I think that gets talked about way too much at the moment, cyber is obviously the other big one. Almost every ELT or board that I speak to is concerned about cyber. Again, they don't always know exactly why or what they need to do about it, but they are definitely very concerned. And I think overall that's a really good thing, because the problem we've had in past years has often been that boards have kind of turned a blind eye to it, assumed it's a technical challenge that can be left to the technical team. They don't have to worry about it. A lot of the work I do, in fact, what I'm doing at the moment, other than this conference, is presenting to lots and lots of boards, specifically talking about their roles and not teaching them about cyber from a technology perspective, but helping them to understand their governance role.
It's really timely as well, as you mentioned, cyber, for those of us that are in Australia around. At the moment, there's the new Australian Financial Service Licence, the regulations, and the PSRA for the Payment Services Reform that the Australian government is trying to do, and that heavily focuses on cyber, coincidentally. So I feel like you're going to have more conversations coming up by the sounds of it. So that's really good to know as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was really insightful, really practical. I can see a lot of people are commenting on how great that presentation was. I will ask the audience before we leave this session and jump to our last few sessions of our Asia Pacific agenda. Reach out to Alice. You can actually connect with him in the AirMeet platform. You've got his LinkedIn, his website. We'll take full advantage of a ex-CIO and VCIO to make sure you reach out to him for anything that you need as well. And yeah, it's great having you here, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks very much, Fatima, and thanks everyone for listening. I hope it helped.